All right, everybody, I'm here to give you a little video in defense of Blanche DuBois. I know a lot of people don't like her when they read this story, but hopefully after I explain a few things, you'll at least, feel a little bit bad for her. Um, she went through a lot in her life, and hopefully you got to the point in the story that I'm not giving you too many spoilers. But she, comes to New Orleans and she's downtrodden and she comes with the last bit of her things in that trunk. Her clothes, her pearls, and some paperwork of what she has left, and that's it. That's all she has. And she is known for lying and fibbing and drinking a lot of alcohol, but not that this excuses her behavior, but it might help to explain it a little bit. So if you haven't gotten to this point in the story, hopefully you have. You should have finished it by now. But she was married when she was young to a young man who was gay and not open about it. And she catches him with another man. And we find out this through her telling Mitch this story. So her husband's gay, and she says that he's a disgrace and that she's ashamed. And tells him that to his face, and then he commits suicide when they're out one night, and that's when we hear that gunshot. And she really doesn't go into too much detail about that particular moment, but that's when she hears the polka music. It triggers that for her. It triggers that memory, and she has a really hard time with this. She's never really gotten over it. So what I study with trauma theory really helps to make sense of this, and this is one of the paper topics. So if you're interested in this, feel free to read up on this a little bit. Hopefully you are. It's something that's really interesting for me and helped me to kind of make sense of the story a little bit more. I read this story several times in undergrad and grad school, and I've taught it so many times, and then about a year ago, I guess, all of a sudden this started to make sense with all of this trauma that she's been through. So when her husband commits suicide, she's only about 17 or 18. And if we notice, some of her behaviors, she has an affair with a student, and she taught high school. So he's around the same age that her husband was. When she flirts with the paper boy that comes to collect the money, he's about 17 or 18 years old. And, we see her acting out this relationship that, just ended without her really knowing too much other than that. It was a sham the whole time. And her whole life after that really becomes, a sham. And it becomes this illusion that she's trying to hold up, this facade that, most people are seeing right through, especially Stanley. And we don't like, Stanley from the beginning. He's very brutish and, hyper masculine, but he also is the only one who calls her out, and he sees through what she's doing, though he doesn't know why, and he never does find out why, at least not to our knowledge. Stella doesn't tell him. So she's what we call acting out trauma, and there's an article in this topic by Dominic LaCapra, who is the theorist that I based my entire thesis on, that there's two ways that humans cope with trauma. The first one is acting out of trauma, which is what we see with Blanche. She's not coping with this. She hasn't coped with this. And then she's traumatized again at the end of the story. So she acts out this trauma over and over again by flirting with these young boys and having these promiscuous relationships. And even though she was known at, the Tarantula Arms, which was the motel basically, where she was selling herself or being a prostitute, she's doing that to survive at that point, because she was a school teacher who obviously will never be hired anywhere else. And she has no money. Her entire family's died, and, we can hate her, and it's very easy to hate her. But when we start to put together these pieces, these little nuggets that we get throughout the story, her story starts to make a lot more sense. Usually by the end of the story, most people feel bad for her. Some people will say, she got herself into this mess, but especially once she is, and if you didn't, it's not stated directly, but Stanley does rape her in the story while his wife is giving birth in the hospital or recovering from giving birth. So that makes Stanley all the more dislikable and all the more sympathetic it makes Blanche. So she just keeps acting this out, and she's trying to live in this illusion. And this is one of the questions that was in your discussion, is her, why does she keep up this illusion? Why does she keep telling these lies about this Shep Huntley that we don't even know if he exists? We never find out if he exists. And some of you were really great in talking about how this becomes a defense mechanism for her. I think that's really interesting to think about, that she's really just trying to protect herself. And I think once we see that and make sense of that, you can see it. That's what she's doing throughout the entire play. She's trying to protect herself, from going deeper into despair. She has nothing. She has no home. She has no family except for Stella, who ultimately chooses her husband over her sister, which I could never imagine doing. If that happened today, would it be a similar outcome? Probably not. So it's really interesting to read this play in terms of the Me Too movement and things like that. But anyway, that's a little bit of a digression there. But she keeps replaying this. She keeps acting out this trauma of trying to be who she was when her husband committed suicide, because in her mind, she's stuck there. She never gets out of that moment. And that's really what it means to be traumatized, is to be stuck in that and to keep replaying it. And she just never stops being 17 or 18, however old she is in there. She's stuck there forever. And if you know anything about trauma, or if you've unfortunately experienced a trauma in your life, you know that moment defines your existence for a very long time if you don't deal with it. And Blanche did not deal with this. They didn't know. They were probably still calling this shell shock back then. They weren't even calling it PTSD. And we don't want to diagnose her with PTSD, but I think it's pretty obvious that that's what's going on. Whether or not she has the disorder, she was traumatized. That's a given by this, because she tells Mitch about it, but she still has a hard time describing it. And every time she hears that music, she goes into this frenzy. She still has these flashbacks and nightmares about this night because she felt responsible and because she was so young. Imagine dealing with that when you're 17 or 18 years old. So in her mind, she's still 17. She's still 18 in her mind. And that's why she doesn't see a problem flirting with these young men, even though we're like, oh my gosh, that's so creepy, because she's about 30. We don't really know how old she is, because that's another one of her illusions. She has a hard time saying that it's been so long since this happened, because if she has to admit that she's 30 or 31, saying, well, you know what, that happened 13, 14 years ago, it diminishes that experience for her. I hope I'm making sense a little bit here. I don't normally record myself or go off without bouncing ideas off of people. So I have some notes here I'm going on, but I figured you could at least kind of see my face and get a more full explanation of what's going on. Because when I write it, I could write all this out, but I feel like this is a little bit more candid, and I'm going to get more out of it, and it won't be as edited. It won't sound like an academic paper. So really, at the end of all of this, can we blame Blanche for what she's done? And again, if you've gotten to the end of the play, do you feel bad for her yet? She gets shipped off to a mental institution because Stella says, I couldn't believe her, and go on living with Stanley. And then we get mad at Stella, who's kind of been defending Blanche this whole time. And then she lets Stanley send her off to an institution and get shipped off, and Stella's very upset. And Stella really doesn't have another choice. She doesn't have her own money. She doesn't have a job. She doesn't have any family to take care of her. So if she chooses Blanche's side, she's putting herself and her child kind of on Skid Row, for lack of a better term. They would all be on the street. And I think she has her child interests in mind, even though Stanley is very abusive. Things are not going to get better for them, but in her mind, this is the only choice she has. So we really have to think about the historical context here. This is 1940s, post-World War II, post-Great Depression. They don't have any money. They don't have a lot of opportunities, especially the women. Stella's not educated. She comes from a wealthy family, but that family money's gone, which we find out from Blanche. Right? So all of these characters have all of these things going on, and Stanley's not a likable character, but he's the only honest character in this play too. So we kind of have to give him that. And then he rapes Blanche because he knows at that point that no one's going to believe her because she's been telling lies this whole time. And I think Stella wants to believe her, but she says, to repeat, I couldn't go on living with Stanley and believe her story. So she had to make a choice whether or not to believe her. But that tells us that she knows her husband was capable of that, and that she's definitely stuck in that marriage. So we have all of these things going on, and then we have the end of the play, and I don't think anybody's picked this one yet. Even if you don't read or decide to answer the question, do read that little bit that I posted about the poker, because that's going to help the end of the story make a lot of sense. Poker is a game that really could just keep going. It's a game that relies on you being able to keep a straight face, even if you're lying. So I have kind of, what 7-card stud is there, and that's the end of the play. And the original title of the play was the poker night. And that's the night that, Stanley hits Stella, is when they're playing poker and all his friends are there. And we find out in that scene too that, and I think it was Mary that posted this in her discussion. This is not the first time this has happened, and it's not going to be the last. And she just keeps forgiving him, either because she doesn't have a choice or because she really thinks she loves him. She says it's so exciting. He breaks things and it excites her, and it's like, what's wrong with you? But again, she doesn't know anything else, right? Stella's still considerably young, and she doesn't know any better until the end of the play. And we have Stella she's crying at the end of this play, and, Stanley's trying to, comfort her in that moment, and there is no comforting her. So if you haven't seen the movie with Marlon Brando, I posted a clip from it in last week's discussion. But the film version has a little bit of a twist on the ending, and I actually like that better. I like what the directors did there. It has a little bit more of a hopeful ending. It's still the same. Blanche still gets shipped off to the mental institution. It's still implied that Stanley raped her. But Stella takes a little bit of a stand at the end of that. So if you're interested in seeing that, I think you can rent it pretty cheap on Amazon. Most of the scenes are on YouTube. If you liked the play, it's one of my favorites. I'm really, really sad that we didn't get to read this in class. So I'm hoping that this video is helpful. I know it's hard for you all to get on the internet at the same time for the WebEx. But next week, if you can, I would appreciate as many of you logging on as possible so we can talk about the research paper, because this is what everybody's going to be writing on. I had this planned anyway, but I think it actually worked out that I did all of the kind of the legwork for you with the research paper and finding the sources and posting them for you there. If you didn't check out my YouTube video from last week, highly recommend you do that as well, because that gives just a quick overview of all of the different topics that you can pick from for this paper. All right, so that's just my 2 cents on the end of the play and what's going on in the play. And since so many of you decided to go with that song as well, I posted a separate post about that with option number 1. And it's an Ella Fitzgerald song. It's actually a really pretty song that you would not normally associate with something so horrific happening. So we have that contrast happening there too. So do listen to the song. It's only like 2.5 minutes. And think about it in terms of what Blanche is saying, because we're reading the play, right? Plays are meant to be watched. So as many scenes as you can get your hands on YouTube, I highly recommend watching. They're really not meant to be read. And normally I would do a couple scenes aloud in class, read some lines for you. But again, we don't have that luxury. So I think that was all I had. So this is a little bit long. Please do take a few minutes to watch this. I hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to comment below. I'll respond back in writing or quick little videos. But I did want to talk to you all, see your faces, and I'm glad that you're enjoying it. I hope everybody's doing okay. Shoot me a message, shoot me an email. Let me know if you need anything. Have a great day. Stay healthy, everybody. And I'll post something else next week, hopefully, if this goes over well.